All right, let's kick off then we can get to lunch. Okay, so good morning everybody. Thank you for attending my presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about 5D and 4D workflows and the design and implementation of those workflows. So I'll be going through a bit of the theory behind the workflows that we've been working on at Mitchell Brantman, but then also take you through a case study that shows kind of where we've come from and what we're actually achieving now moving forward as well. So my name is Caitlin Shields. I'm an associate and 5D quantity surveyor at Mitchell Brantman Quantity Surveyors, so private quantity surveying firm. I'm based up in Brisbane, but as you'll soon find out, the companies really invest a lot of time in BIM and 5D and 3D model research and development, and we're big advocates for it. So that enables our humble little company that's based down the east coast of Australia to work on some pretty cool projects actually, and that's what I'm going to show you today. So as an industry, we've come to accept some pretty strange things in regard to cost and time. For example, if we go out to tender, we've now accepted that we just go out to a traditional competitive lump sum tender. That has a level of risk associated with it. A lot of the term risk has been used a lot this morning, and I'll use it again. But that has a lot of uncertainty about it. We're going out to tender. Generally, if you engage a QS beforehand, they'll give you an estimate of where it should land. But ultimately, you're saying out to 4, 5, maybe 10 different people, how much would you build it for? And this competitive bid has this level of uncertainty of how they're feeling at the time, how busy they are, what's going on in the market, and things like that. We work off rule of thumb contingencies, so talking about the P50, the P90 estimates and how much contingency we put in there, there's a lot of rule of thumb that's used there because it's not an actual known situation. So without known, we're kind of just making allowances, and they generally fall back of rule of thumb as opposed to project-specific or site-specific contingencies. And then as you're moving through, scope changes and variations happen along the way. So some can't really be avoided if you get out to site and you hit something that was unexpected. But there's a lot of variations that through design could actually be better managed and better coordinated to make sure that there's less happening out on site, because that's when it's most expensive to change things. When you look at the time uncertainty, we're talking about programming challenges that, particularly on large projects, again is a rule of thumb situation. So you're trying to understand how long something would take over over a number of years. That will generally blow out, and it's typically doing so in the past. We work to standard S-curves in building projects, so to organise cash flows, to understand how much should be costed out every month. And there's also a lack of project status clarity. So we're not really sure at any given point in time, according to the program or to the contract program, where we're sitting in a level of detail that should be coordinated. So those barriers are today's opportunities, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Is there's 3D models, and who's aware of BIM? Building Information Modelling, great. Through the technology and software applications and BIM, we are actually we're enabled to understand these projects better, have better certainty around them, more trust and transparency about them to actually manage projects better. So just by way of definition, if a 3D model is the model itself, and an author will create content that is a 3D model that most of us are fairly familiar with, 4D is the time associated with it, and then 5D is the cost associated with it. So as a quantity surveyor or a cost planner, I'll normally tag myself as being a 5D quantity surveyor, and that's because I associate myself with using and being able to utilise models. When we use that for a timing sense, that's when we start to look at the 4D situation as well. So once we get a 3D model, all good design models are rich in data. They will have inherent geometry attached to them just by the nature of the software applications that we're using. That will also lead to quantities. Quantities can be dynamically linked to the models. And if you think about it, quantity leads both cost and time outcomes. If you're preparing a cost plan, you need to understand the quantum of the project in order to attach a rate associated to get a cost. If you're looking at the timing of a project, in order to understand how many slab pours, how long that would take, there's a quantity that needs to be achieved as well in order to drive those outcomes. If you can actually dynamically link those quantities through time and cost back to the models, it means they can be visualized and therefore they can be trusted as well. A picture paints 1,000 words, and as you'll see in the presentation, when you start to see these models, you instantly get an idea of what the scope of the project is, the quantum of the project, but more to it, when you drill down further and look at these quantities and the inherent geometry within the models, it leads to a level of trust that really can't be disputed as we go through in our industry. Then we can actually simulate the cost in time. So again, I'll show you some movies of some simulations where we're actually practicing the construction in the computer before we even get to site. So this means we can proactively manage things like cost and time right from its inception before we get out to site and start worrying about the day-to-day. So there's a lot more planning involved, a lot more coordination, and therefore it's managed a bit more proactively. And generally speaking, when you think of a model, a good model will have good data attached to it. A great model will have great data attached to it, you know, the garbage in, garbage out type situation. But even a shit model generally has some good quantities in there as well. So don't just throw it out because it may look like it's in its infancy. Because we can start to drill in and have a look, again, as I said, even if all you do is look at it, you're understanding a level of the information and the scope of the job more than just the 2D interpretation of what you could do. So we never throw out any models. We try to use as much as we possibly can right from conceptualization, because any data is good data to us. It's just that manner of layering over information and putting more and more detail into it for use in quantities. So if you haven't sussed it already, for us and in project controls, quantity is king. It's all about understanding how large these things are, how it needs to be broken up, and that's what we're going to work through today. Mitchell Brantman has worked really hard over the last more than a decade in making sure we understand models so we can pull them to pieces, extract out the information we need to, understand how they're created so we can look at the back end and use them. So that leads me to the case study, which I'll talk through now. So a few years ago, we'd really kind of cracked, quite a long time ago, the 5D side of things, so how to use models for cost. And then more recently, within the last 5 years, we started to realise that cost and time are kind of driven from that same thing, quantity is king. So how do we actually make them work together, or how can we actually utilise that to coordinate them a bit more? Because if we have the 3D model, we have cost and time associated with it. As I've mentioned, there's so many powerful things we can achieve with that and proactively manage a project. So we'd kind of cracked this in terms of a workflow a few years back. We were pretty confident that we had the right recipe, so to speak, of how to make these three things talk together. And we were approached by Gamuda, which is a contractor in Malaysia, a large contractor in Malaysia. They had this plan to become quite BIM savvy across the board. So not just claiming that they can have 3D models, they wanted to push the boundaries of how they utilised BIM. And they were looking for someone that could help them. They didn't want to reinvent the wheel. They were looking for someone out there that could actually guide them in how to use more than just the model, the 4D and the 5D aspect of it, so the cost and the time. Because traditionally there's a lot of models that are going on and they're not used. They're printed out in a contractual sense for 2D documentation and not used much more than that. So Gamuda were really keen, and they're quite groundbreaking in the fact that they really want to make BIM a part of their day-to-day in all aspects of their company. So they approached us to do what we do, I guess, but more than just saying, here's how we do it and here's how you should do it to Gamuda. What we actually put forward was, we've got a workflow, but we want to be flexible in how we actually apply it for Gamuda. There's not one right way to do this, but there is a same workflow, it's just making it flexible enough to be company specific. And that's what we offered them, to work with Gamuda to make the workflows work for them. So the project itself, that they wanted to kind of prototype and implement this on, was by no means just a small test project. We worked with them on the KVMRT Line 2. So that's the Klang Valley Mass Rapid Transport Line 2. They had worked through Line 1 in a non-BIM sense. They ran into a couple of problems along the way, and they were keen not to make the same mistakes again. So they actually kind of lifted everything up and said, for Line 2, we want to BIM the shit out of it, essentially. And that's where we came in, is there was a lot of coordination issues. This job was highly complex. It's right smack bang in the middle of Kuala Lumpur. So if you've ever driven through that, it's a bit of a mess. But just imagine then going underground. So the bit that we were involved in was the 11 underground stations. And there was mass coordination issues. They did case studies or cost-benefit studies of, do we knock the building down because its foundations are going to get in the line of the rail line? Or is that too expensive and we have to go around? So they tried to make the path of least resistance, but sometimes they just had to go around buildings, and that's where you'll see some kinks in the lines in the visuals that you can see. So quite complex. They're trying to fit these 11 station boxes that were underground in amongst an existing Kuala Lumpur city, which is complex in itself. Klang Valley itself has some interesting foundation issues to how they retain the buildings themselves. So the consultants were actually using 3D models as a basis anyway, just by the way of how that consultant worked. So there were models in place, but there was, again, by no means any BIM execution plan. There was no mandate to do this. This was self-driven from Gamuda to say, if there's models there, we want to be able to utilise them better. All right. So in terms of specifics, our role was to deliver and implement 5D and 4D BIM, and more importantly, design an advanced and tailored 5D, 4D workflow to overlay those traditional processes that they were already using. One of the things that we were quite keen to keep was retaining the same or similar software that they were already using. Like I said, we didn't want to come in and just say, here's how we do it, here's how you should do it. We kind of worked with them and said, what are you currently using and how can we adapt that to make this workflow work? And then more than that, so rather than just doing the 5D and 4D, saying, here's your quantities, see you later, they actually set up a BIM Academy within Gamuda as a separate site office actually, and we led the 5D, 4D BIM modules within that academy as well. So not only were we working on quantities and time in a live sense on the project, we were also teaching it to their team members. So the next generation of the 5D leaders within the business could move forward with it. We weren't just plugging in and plugging out again. They wanted Gamuda to be able to move forward with this and us to pull back at the end of the day. Slight complication though, we didn't go in at day zero. We actually jumped in at about pre-final, so they'd already gone through tender, they'd already gone through their working documentation, and they were actually getting ready to subcontract this out. So we had to work quite rapidly to mobilise ourselves into the company, train the cost planners and the programmers, but also be ready for these subcontract packages. So we were working live on the project as we were training Gamuda as well. So there had to be some considerations in that. We didn't want to be too bullish about anything. We had to be considerate of the existing processes in place. So probably the most integral step that we took was what we call the discovery phase. We spent about 3 weeks with our core team of cost planners, and we interviewed a lot of people from management level, upper, middle management, right through to the working QSs. We interviewed teams to just understand, what they were doing at that point in time, how they were currently working together, and how we could integrate with it as well. And it was interesting, we found that there was, not overly surprising, but kind of surprising, there was a lot of inefficiencies. That wasn't surprising. When you work in a traditional sense, there will be inefficiencies. But there was large teams working on it. For 11 underground stations, they had a team of over 100 QSs working on that. extracting quantities from 2D information just repetitively. Once they'd finished a package, they pretty much had to work onto the package again for a next revision. And more than that, there was a duplication of effort. So when we started to work through and meet the programmers as well, we actually found that walking through the office, we went and said g'day to all the programmers, tried to understand how they work and what they were working off of. And then to get to the cost planners, there was a big locked door. So the programmers were not meant to talk to the cost planners in any case. And to us, that's a little bit crazy because, like I said at the start, both of those outputs of the programming and the cost planning is driven from a very similar base of the quantities. So the duplication happens where programmers could be quantifying something to create a program. Across this locked door, cost planner is probably doing the same thing. And where the room for error lies is what revision is either one of those people working on at any given point in time. They were heavily reliant on slow manual tasks. There was a lot of 2D documentation, which makes complications like revisions. And they were quite reactionary to solutions for complex problems. These projects are quite complex in themselves. So working on a 2D basis, when it takes you 1 month just to get a quantity of one station box of the floor finishes, if anything had changed in that month, they've got to start again. So they're actually behind the 8 ball when it comes to actually solving any issues that need to happen. The good thing that was in there was an established digital Revit team of 5 people. So they were kind of the core group of people that were utilising the designers' models and analysing it and seeing how it could be used for Gamuda's sense. So there were 3D models in existence, but like I said, there was by no means a BIM execution plan. These models existed because the consultants were doing that as a means to their documentation anyway. So in terms of that level of documentation that we expected, we didn't expect too much, but we were pleasantly surprised that, like I said, even with a base model that will have a disclaimer that it was never made for quantification purposes, there'll be some intrinsic information and geometry in it anyway, and that's what we were looking for. So after our discovery period, we went back and spent a week doing a prototype to show Gamuda how we were going to produce this tailored workflow. So we took one of their station boxes, and just in terms of scale, these things are about 200 metres long and can get up to 70 metres deep for the D walls. So they're quite large buildings, even though this little snippy of it makes it look like a small boat. They're quite large things. There's a lot of concrete that goes into these. There's a lot of finishes that goes into these as well. So in 1 week, we managed to produce everything that you see on screen. So straight up from 5D quantification, we extracted as many model quantities as we could from the models. Then we started to look at revisioning, how we would actually run this over and over again. The models were being updated every 2 weeks. So whereas in a 2D sense, the cost planners were probably working off a month-long iteration, we were starting to say, well, actually, let's work off the latest. Every time those models drop in a fortnight, we're going to use that and quantify it as well. We worked on looking at virtual trade packages, so how they could actually communicate these quantities to other people. And this is where this dynamic link between quantity and model is really great, is if there's any query about the quantity, you right-click on it, you say, show me where that quantity is, and it'll take you straight to it. So these virtual trade packages is just a visualization of the quantities themselves. Then we start to overlay the programming side of it as well. So we were able to get a version of their P6 or Primavera schedule, and we started to identify objects by activity code or work breakdown structure and attach this sequencing to that. Further to that, then we start to join them all together. So where we quantify it with rates and costing, we also quantify it, break it up into a work breakdown structure, and we can start to simulate cash flows as well. So we were able to achieve all of these things in 1 week for one station box. And what we realised quite quickly, and this is kind of where the magic happens, if you do it for one, you can repeat it on many. And this is where the power of BIM is whereas the traditional teams had different teams associated to different station boxes, so they weren't really interested in what the other stations were doing. We started to say, well, if there's concrete in this one, there's going to be concrete again in this one, and this one, and this one. Let's start to look at the repetitive nature of how we can quantify this. And we started to do that very rapidly. So this is the workflow we came back with after a week. And it looks a little bit complicated. Only because you're jumping in and out of different software packages all the time. And the reason we do this is because, A, as I said at the top of the job, at the presentation, that we wanted to maintain software that the Gamuda were familiar with already. They were already using Revit, they were already using Primavera, and they were already using Navisworks. So those software applications wanted to remain. The only kind of addition that we brought to it, and this is a foundation of what we do, and they saw the benefit in as well, was Celebri and Costex. So that's where we validate and quantify the models. So it looks overly complex, but for us, it's kind of our day-to-day. It works into the workflow that we know and understand to be correct, and it's easily adaptable. At any given point in time, not one piece of software is going to do everything that you need, or if they claim to, I'll go have a chat to them because that's interesting to me. But it's about creating a solution to a workflow, not a piece of software. And that's what we were working with, and that's why it looks a little bit complicated. It's actually making it quite flexible. And at the end of the day, if nothing else talks to each other, everything talks through Excel. So that helps, and you'll see that a lot in our workflows. Okay, so what we started to produce with the Gamuda was virtual cash flows and simulations. So like I said, once we could isolate the quantities for cost reasons, we could isolate the quantities for timing reasons, we mash that all together and we start to create these simulations. Now, I'm sure most of you would have seen a simulation like this before. It's kind of familiar if you're familiar with BIM itself. And this is kind of just the Hollywood to us. It's the visuals that looks cool. People use it in bids these days. What we're interested in, and it's really hard to see on these tiny little TVs, is right in the top left-hand side of this screen is actually ticking through cost over time. So at any given point, you could pause this simulation and say, well, in February 2021, how much should we have spent? How much is left to go? And you can start to overlay what the contracted was versus the actual as well. So as cool as this graphic looks, and it always does look cool to me anyway, I'm a nerd though, the real cool stuff is the data behind it and how you attach those quantities to cost and time. So that's what we started doing. Just to explain, this software is the Navisworks side of it. So we did all the hard work in the other software applications and we used Navis for this simulation. So scrolling across the bottom of the screen is the program that we got out of P6. And then the model is obviously the one that's tracking through. The time and the cost is how we've broken it up and quantified it as well. So what this unlocks, more than just forecasting and cash flows, is we can actually start to unlock things like milestones, progress assessments, and actually tracking actuals on site. So further to what we did in that simulation, we started to actually track what was happening at any given point in time. Were they ahead of schedule? Were they behind schedule? And we've started working with some people on looking at earned value in that regard as well, because it's all linked as well. So here's how we kind of look at it or break it down is by a certain point in time, how much should we have spent, how much have we spent, and actually coordinating the actuals on a job. Rather than a traditional kind of claim, someone goes and assesses it, have a bit of an argument, agree kind of roughly where that percentage should be. This is working on actuals, actual quantifications of every bit of that model that was broken down into work breakdown structures. A kind of cool story that came out of this, and this is what we discovered while we were in there in our discovery phase, is by joining this cost and time aspect, we started to have conversations with Gamuda about a problem, a fairly big problem they knew they were going to hit, and that is that this project would actually demand more concrete than what Malaysia could supply at some point in time. What they didn't know was when. So that was something that was like a looming danger for them, and they kind of had just resigned themselves to the fact that at some point it'll happen. We went in there and we started to work through this time and cost analysis and started working through the program, and we actually helped them pinpoint roughly when that would happen, or at least how to coordinate it around that issue. So we were working with them on live complex problems while we were live in the project as well. And that was a really cool success story to show, rather than just coming in there being glitz and glam with them in terms of the simulations, we were helping them solve real problems that they were facing in the job. So more than just the implementation and doing those practicalities of working through time and cost with them, we then went and did the BIM Academy. So quite technically, it was 4 weeks worth of content, and we developed the content to that, and we structured it in a way that kind of layers on information itself. So some of these cost planners and programmers had never even seen this project in a 3D sense at all before we got with them in the academy. So they set up an academy at an off-site office location. They had all the hardware, they made sure they had all the software ready for us, and we actually worked through 2 different teams. One team would see us in the morning between 8 a.m. and 12 midday, every day for 4 weeks straight. So that's obviously a big cost that Gamuda did to actually lend us these people to be off-site, off the tools, to come and learn about this technology. And then team 2 would come in from midday to 4 p.m. every afternoon. So we'd run through our curriculum twice over in a day for 4 weeks running. And as I said, we layered upon information. We started the first week with just understanding digital data. For people that may not have heard of it, and not many had, we started to talk about how models were created, what software applications are typically used, and what was used on this job, so Revit being the main one. But also understanding if it's built up this way, this is how you can break it down. And that's how we understand things to quantify them. We spoke about model validation, so that's looking at things like clash, coordination, or understanding that things are labelled appropriately, so a column is a column and a wall is a wall. You'd be surprised how many times those 2 things get confused, and we check for that. The next week, we layered upon the 5D quantity takeoff. So looking at, again, we were using the software Costex, looking how, once you put it into the Costex, how you can extract quantities from those models. 4D, the 3rd week, we layered on the time aspect of it. So the programmers got excited at that point in time, because then they were actually attaching their program to the model in a visual sense that they'd never seen before. And then the last week, we joined it all together. So we started to play those simulations where you have time and cost. We started to look at cash flowing and things like that. And the interesting thing about who was in the room, whereas when we did our discovery phase and found a locked door between the 2 different entities, we talked to Gamuda about actually having a mix of both in the room. So they could actually start to say, a lot of our processes start from the same kind of core. Quantity is what's leading both of our outputs, so how are we going to use it? And it opened up this discussion and this collaboration between the 2 entities that had previously never really existed. So that was a kind of win for us as well. So from that, we ran the academy a few times over to make sure we could capture a lot of the workers from middle management and the doers to train them up. And then we had this kind of support network to make sure that it was actually implemented. Like I said, our intent was never to jump in, do something and say, see you later, good luck. We wanted to make sure that Gamuda were left with a skill set that they could run forward with. So they're quite successfully implementing it now. They used it on the remainder of the project. We spoke to them for a few months after, checked in with them and make sure they were understanding it at a more complex level and without the net being, or with the net being taken away of us not being there. And they've worked through that quite successfully. I've been watching them on social media and they're winning a lot of awards for the BIM aspect in infrastructure, because they're really, it was this accomplishment that they set out to achieve a long time ago, and now they're actually doing it. So that was really cool to see. And what we did is kind of lay the groundwork to establishing a CDE, or a common data environment. Without kind of the 4D, 5D aspect, the CDE would have just been a repository for some models. So laying over that information of cost estimates and programs all in a visual sense in a CDE is really important to them, that at any one given point in time, anyone can access the information in that central database. Then we lay over the integration with GIS. So they actually started to play, this is opening up obviously wider than the 4D, 5D things, but this is how far this company has really come or pushed forward with BIM. But they started looking at drone technology to do scans and quantifying earthworks that could happen. As you can imagine, excavating a box the size of these things is quite a big task. So they started looking at drone technology for quantifying how much earthworks had happened at any given point in time. And that's kind of cool. We were playing around with that back at our home base with how drones can work through quantification. But in Malaysia, the laws are a little bit more relaxed, so you could actually pilot these drones around site pretty easily without too many complications or restrictions. There was one incident where the drone was flown into a crane though, so these restrictions are in place for a reason. All right, and then point cloud scans and drone photogrammetry. So that's extending on that as well. And point cloud scans are kind of cool as well. We are looking at that, and we're actually using that on a couple of projects in Australia at the moment, where you're using the point cloud scanners to scan your job, send it up to be actually modelled to match the point cloud survey, and then brought back down to quantify it. So you're actually using the point cloud laser scanning to quantify and then assess jobs and their progress as well. So they've come quite a ways. A couple of challenges, because it wasn't all kind of rosy. Obviously there are challenges along the way, and particularly that keynote speaker at the top of the day really resonated with what I kind of came away with, is a lot of the implementation challenges come down to people. Is you can put as many checks and balances and workflows on paper, but it's really about how the people take it up. So we spent quite a bit of time, 4 weeks seeing someone repetitively, day in, day out, actually creates this level of trust. They had a level of buy-in, so that was helping. But it was in a live, intense environment. Those people still had to go back and do their job and still count things at the end of the day. That job was still live as we were teaching this stuff. So we had to move quite quickly with them and be responsive. The tasks that we were doing in the academy were directly related to the tasks they needed to do in their office. So when they needed to quantify a certain thing, that's what we focused on for the day. We were trying to get live outcomes in the education of it as well. We had to make sure that we weren't trampling on an embedded culture or embedded practice too much. Talking to people about how rapidly you can do things, people get a bit scared of that. This conversation, I get asked all the time as a cost planner, well, if models have quantities in them, does that mean there won't be a cost planning or quantity surveyors in 10 years' time? Which is a reasonable question, I guess, if you're actually thinking that models create quantities. What does a quantity surveyor do? But just to clarify, I hope to be around after 10 years' time, and it's because we don't want to quantify things. Quantifying is the easy side of cost planning or quantity surveying. We want to be able to quantify it rapidly. That's why we're such advocates of 3D modelling and 5D. We want to quantify it rapidly so we can focus on our job as a consultant and being a good cost planner, understanding benchmark history, working towards solving problems like the concrete supply issue, doing something more than just quantifying concrete. So that's what we had to kind of get around and talk with the people about is, if your day-to-day task is quantifying right now, let's think about the potential of what you could be doing with this technology, not the barriers to it. There was, there's a picture of us eating durian and frogs. So there was, an existing culture there as well. In that particular company in Malaysia, it's very hierarchical. So we had to make sure when we were talking to the right people, make sure we had to keep to time. We had to respect, we were there over Ramadan for a certain period, so we had to respect things like that as well. And as I said, a change management came into it as well. When we walked into the office on day dot, we were faced with a company that had locked doors between certain people or certain entities. We had to respect and kind of talk to them about change management. Maybe the cost planners should be talking to the programmers, and they don't need to know specifics. There's obviously some information that might not want to be shared, like certain rates and to certain costs of the project. But if we can start to talk to each other and collaborate on that quantity level, how can that company actually move forward more efficiently? And then there's further opportunities that we kind of discovered and we were suggesting to them, and just as a general, I guess, concept, is looking at how far these models can actually take us. Is when you look at models in their kind of infancy, the first thing that I would look for is a structural model will give me some concrete formwork, reinforcement by way of factor, because not many people are actually modelling bar by bar the reinforcement. But when they are there, the power of that is really, really cool. We actually found one model, someone must have been bored one day, one model when we were on this project actually had reinforcement bars modelled into it. So I was pleasantly surprised to find someone had taken the time to model in bar by bar the reinforcement. And I actually set a challenge to myself and timed myself on quantifying the reinforcement bar by bar and location by location. It took me 13 minutes. So the power of this, if the time is invested in the modelling of it, the outputs of this and how you can utilise that is really, really powerful stuff. So I'll leave you with that. I guess the message out of all of this is we need to be disruptive, but we need to be cautious that there are existing workflows in place. So how do we kind of overlay them together or integrate them together to make sure that we're still running through, our industry is a fairly slow-moving industry, if you think of it, being the construction industry in comparison to some others. So how do we make sure we use this? It's ready to use, it's ready to be utilised. How do we use it while still working in this kind of space of our traditional sense as well? Models instantly will create trust through visualisation, so how do we overlay that with quantities as well? If you don't know how to leverage 3D models, find someone that does. There's a few of us out there, and once you kind of find the power of this, it's really, really cool, and it just opens up so many more opportunities as well for the project. And that's that. Are there any questions? Or, yeah, a few before we go to lunch.
Yeah, hi, that's really fascinating. I like the way you're addressing bulks. Did you address long lead time and offsite fabrication at all in your models? Is that something that you considered, or is that down the track a bit?
Yes, certainly. So that's something that was considered and talked about with the programmers. So once they're quantifying it, they need to understand the lead time to bring it onto site. That was everything that they considered in there, so we didn't touch that technically. But the quantification of that opened that up, so they could understand their precast D-walls when they would get to site. Gamuda have a precast factory, so they were quite aware of how long it would take at that aspect, and it was built into the program.
Okay. But the cost for that, was there a time lag on the model so that you actually spent the cost, 3 or 4 months before this?
Sure. Yeah. So you break up the work breakdown structure of when it's being built off-site and the cost associated with that, and then what would visually appear in those simulations was the actual installation of it, and that would complete the cost for that task. So you would split it in two for off-site and on-site. Okay. Yeah.
With a lead on the off-site?
Yeah. It's just that visually, so you could quantify it in the data. Visually, you wouldn't see that off-site things happening, but it would be ticking through in the cost, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any others? A few? Hi.
This one. How important was it or is it to get the planners and the modelers on the same page up front so that when you want to bring it all together, they can compare an apple with an apple?
Yeah, sure. So for those that might not have heard, is how important is it to get the programmers with the modelers? And it's really important, and I would say the same for the cost planners as well. Unfortunately, like in this situation, we came in at about that pre-final stage, so kind of halfway through getting to final stage. And we've done it on many projects before where we come in and we go, oh, if only we'd been engaged 6 months prior, we could have had a conversation with the modelers about if you just tweak this, this and this, we could have done something better. And it's not too much of a change. We actually do have conversations and saying, just change this slightly or just do this, or be mindful that we're quantifying for the purpose of construction. So in your example of hooking up with the programmers, they don't just want to see one big slab in one piece of model. They need to have it broken up into their pour sets. But that's a gradual thing that they work through. For example, right at the start, they just want to know the overall quantity and they can break it up. Once it's actually broken up, then the model needs to represent that as well. So the conversation right at the top, which I think is really important and doesn't happen enough, should more just be about designers don't need to change too much. Like I said, even at a base level, when these models aren't made for quantification, there's still a heap in there that we can get out of it. It's more just being aware of the fact that they will be used for quantification. So we have conversations with people about at some point in time, we will want to see that model broken up, how it will be built. Don't just do a wall that goes from ground level to level 16 in one piece. We're going to start to ask the question of breaking it up. So you get the overall quantity, but also then we can break it up into the work breakdown structure. Does that answer your question? Like, yeah, pretty much vital to be there at the start, but not a deal breaker. We usually come in about the halfway point when we say not too late, but it would have been nice to be a little bit ahead.
Essentially, at the start, you flash out the WBS, get everybody flying to it and saying,
Yeah.
this is how we're going to use it.
Yeah, well, it needs to happen progressively. Like I said, the programmers don't know how many pours it is till they get an initial quantification anyway. They need to get an understanding of that total quantum of it and then break it down. It's more just being aware to the designers of saying, we're just going to tweak how you do what you do a little bit. Just be aware that we're using it for this reason, and we're going to start to give you feedback as well.
On that workflow, you're showing Primavera in the sort of in the middle, and it's going from Excel spreadsheets to Primavera and out again.
Yes.
How easily was that, or what did you use as expertise and things?
Yep, sure. So we used Excel because there's no kind of button that imports and exports Primavera straight away. But as I said, at its base level, Excel kind of talks to a lot of different software applications, and that's why on either end of that one, we used Excel. The importing and exporting was quite quick once you start to use Excel because the actual program data is set out in that layout anyway. So it's just a matter of like flattening it down into an Excel spreadsheet and pulling in the data as well. What we were looking for was a code of the work breakdown structure and some dates. That's the data we were really looking for out of all that.
So I work for the University of Melbourne, and in our line of work we deal with projects from $20,000 to 20 million. I guess my question is, do you see this 4D or 5D workflow process as being beneficial to projects of any scale, or is it just because I always seem to see these presentations to be about like the large scale projects, but is it applicable to any size project, or what are your thoughts on that?
Short answer is yes. But just to extend on that, it's more about who's doing the modelling. So if there's an architect or a structural engineer that just by the way that they work is in a model sense, we've seen anything from a bus shelter, townhouse, warehouses, right to the extreme when they're really large projects. So there's not one size that kind of meets this threshold to say, now that's kind of model ready. However, there's definitely a level, and large projects, it's not even large projects. It's more about anyone can use 3D models if the designers are using it as a base. And you'd be surprised if you just ask the question, if you see a set of 2D documents and you go to your designers, was this created in a 3D model? They'd probably say yes, because a lot of people, particularly in Australia, are doing that right now. It's just that they're only contracted to print out 2D documentation. So a lot of people are just using it by way of that's how their company operates. They use this software anyway. So no size really matters, but when you start to look at people that are bringing in this concept of BIM as an overall framework, that's more suited to people that are going to be the end asset user. So people that are just going to build a six-pack of townhouses and sell them off at the end of the day aren't too interested about how it's done, how quickly it's going to be built. They want it on time, they want it on budget, they just want it done. Whereas jobs like this, where they're going to hold on to it and retain it, and the complexities of building it, this is where they start to think about, well, let's look at BIM overall rather than just people that use 3D models. So you'd be surprised how many people are already using it on any size of project at a base level.
Okay, you mentioned about description of the models. With regard to sort of coding structures and that sort of thing, do you find that there's a standard across the board, or is it like a multifaceted approach, with, I guess, from the design initial descriptions?
Sure. There is no structure at this point in time. And that's why in the kind of BIM community, people are calling for government-led forums to say this is a code you should probably use, or this is a coding application you should use. But at this point in time, everyone's doing their own thing. So every engineer will use a different code for how they label columns or how they use walls. And that's where you need flexibility in the workflow, is you can't just have a rigid thing of, I'm always going to look, I keep doing that, sorry. I'm always going to look for this set of codes. It doesn't happen that way, not in this point in time anyway. So you have to be flexible with what you're looking for. It would be nice, however, that's never going to satisfy everyone for any given point in time. About 8 years ago, we started looking at codes and how things are actually labelled, and there's a myriad of them out there. We actually started writing our own code to how you could identify things, and we quickly found, again, like software, not one code will solve all your problems. So your workflow needs to be flexible enough to use any sort of set of codes, which is, yeah, you have to deal with what you get at the moment. And even with one company, it's not consistent, so you have to be able to deal with that.
I wanted to know how long will it take to implement this on a medium-sized project, say $500 million project?
Depends on 3 weeks, 52 hours and 7 minutes. No. It depends on the situation. Like I said, the most critical part of what we did in this Gamuda example was spend 3 weeks in discovery, asking questions about how that operated, how that project was going to be run and how it was running at that point in time. So I'd have to find out a whole lot more about who, again, like the keynote of today said, people are an important part. We'd have to meet who's working on it, who are the consultants on the project, are they capable of doing 3D models? If not, how do we get around that? So that's too much of a complex question to answer on the spot. But the whole point is you'd need that discovery phase. That's what I'd say is the critical part, is just self-analysing how things are running at that given point in time. I think that's it. You can go to lunch. Thanks.